In this lesson, we're going to be adjusting the camera lighting and the custom background. So the first thing that we need to do just to see what our departure point is to just simply go and render out a image of where we are starting. So throughout this lesson, I'm going to pause the video each time there's a render to be done, and then we'll have a look at the render and just discuss what some of the issues are and how we can then make changes to our scene to improve our image as we go along. So right now I'm going to be pausing, and then let's have a look at how this render looks. So here's our render and our departure point for this lesson. Now we're going to be dealing with three things in total. We're going to look at the background, the camera, and the lighting. So all in all, your settings are going to be swinging between three different areas. In other words, your lighting is going to be coming from your principal light. In our case, it's the sun. It's going to be coming from your HDRI or your environment, in other words, your secondary lighting. And it's also going to be coming from the settings on your camera. Now, it can sometimes be confusing to know which of those three you actually need to tackle first, or which one is the right one to actually start adjusting so that you can get the right results. So first of all, before we enter that entire trio of confusion as to which exact setting to adjust, let's first make sure that we have our camera angle correct, and then let's go and swap out our background with something that looks a little bit closer to what we're going to eventually do in Photoshop. Now the style of the background, or at least the method of our background, will be done in Photoshop itself. So if I just click on alpha, you'll see that everything that is black is not going to be visible in the actual image that we render into Photoshop. So we're going to be able to add our own custom sky into the back, as well as adjusting the brightness or the hue and saturation of that sky. The second thing that's bothering me in this image is that I'm getting all of these trees in my alpha. I would like to get a much cleaner outline so that I just have the building itself, then I have the trees separately, and then I have the background behind that separately as well. So you can imagine that it's quite difficult to edit the building because you can't really separate it from the trees. So it's for that reason that I had gone and separated my XREF scene file that we had made in an earlier lesson into two separate files. It's now called Trees Background XREF and Plants Foreground XREF. So let's go ahead and turn off this background. Let's just unenable it. And now you'll see that you only have the palms in the foreground as well as the trees in the foreground, and when you render this, you're not going to get those trees in the background. When we do render our final image in the next lesson, then I'll just run through the process as to how we can render out several images that we then overlay. In any case, let's move on now to the background. There are two ways that you can add a custom background for yourself. The first one is to type 8 on your keyboard. This opens up the environment and effects. You can also access that by clicking environment from your rendering menu. Here you have the choice between a solid color, so we can, for example, put a blue color into there, and the entire background will render in that flat color. And this color will not affect your alpha at all. Neither will the map that you add into the actual slot of the environment map. So both those options are quite good with keeping that environment, or at least keeping that alpha out of your final image. The downside is with the environment map is that you can't freely adjust it. So for that reason, I'm going to discuss the second option, which is the one I'm going to use for this particular image. And I'm going to take that arc with the texture of the sea, or at least the sky, because that's the part that I'm interested in, and I'm going to just put that into the background of my camera view. Just before I adjust that background, let me just type in Shift-C on my keyboard, and now I'm going to take that camera that we were looking through earlier, and I'm just going to move it closer to my building. I would like to get a view which crops a certain area out of the scene so that I have a slightly closer view. I can also look at the focal length. I generally like to increase or decrease this depending on the amount of exaggerated angle that I see in the form. So for example, if you put 21 millimeters, you're going to have a much steeper angle. If you exaggerate that, you'll see that these angles become much sharper. So with that 21 degrees, I can now just find a new camera angle. And it's going to be something along these lines, and I'm going to adjust it slightly as I process the next render. So now that I have my camera angle fixed, there will still be some adjustments to it, but once you have it fixed, you can go and now change your background image. And again, I must just repeat that this is something that you're doing just so that you get a blue background in your image so that you can see the color composition of your render, so that you don't have this black background, which is a little bit confusing because it's difficult to set up your lighting with a pitch black or a pitch white background. Next thing, if you are rendering with this type of background, you need to remove it from your alpha computation. So right click on the object, go to V-Ray properties, and just reduce your alpha contribution to 0. And similarly, there's this part of the arc, and we need to do the same thing to this one. So now let's have a look at the actual camera settings. And if I go to this new camera that we just created now, which I believe is camera 7, then the camera settings that we have here is 15 in the shutter speed and 200 in the ISO. We're going to leave the ISO as it is, and if you remember the image looking slightly dark, one of the things that is making it look dark is the vignetting. The vignetting will make it darker in the corners, and this is a camera lens effect. You can add this in Photoshop, and I do recommend that you rather add it in Photoshop so that you have more potential to change things in your post-processing instead of having it darker in your actual raw render itself. So let's uncheck that, and let's also decrease this amount, which means that we are increasing the amount of time that the image is exposed for. So let's make that 12, and let's just hit render on this view again and see what the results are. So I'm now going to pause the video again, and we'll have a look at what that result is. So here's our render with the new camera angle, shutter speed, and new background. So you'll see that everything is looking much brighter. We no longer have that vignetting effect, which is darkening the outsides. We have much more light being perceived by the camera thanks to the shutter speed, and also things are looking a little bit different now that we don't have a black sky. So back to that question of which of the three elements do we adjust first? Do we adjust the sun? Do we adjust the HDRI or the environment? Or do we adjust the camera settings? Now, in this case, we know by looking at this image that if we had to brighten the sun, the chances are that these white areas would probably get overblown. In other words, they would become too white and we would start to lose detail on these areas. So you already can cross out the fact that the sun does not need to be brighter. If we make the camera settings higher, in other words, if we allow more light into the camera, then similarly these areas are going to be brighter and there is going to be more contrast with the actual image. In other words, these dark areas are still going to stay more or less the same. It's just these middle tones and bright tones that are going to become exaggerated. So what this image actually does need is an adjustment of the environment so that we can wash out some of these dark shadows a little bit more. In other words, the contrast is quite high, and the secondary lighting, or the bounce light, or the fill light in the film industry they call it, is going to be helped by the HDRI. So let's just have a look now at what the HDRI settings are. Let's go down to our environment tab, and we can see that we have a HDRI in our slot, and we can now have a look what that is. I'm just going to make some space in the material editor, and let's just instance that across. So right now we have that CG skies file, and if we increase the multiplier even more, or otherwise if we decrease the gamma, we're going to get a brighter effect happening with our HDRI file. So I've increased it from 3 to 4.5. Let's just have a look at what differences there are to the scene now. So in the last couple of minutes I've done a couple of renders, and we can have a look at the differences now. The first one is the original one we saw earlier with the multiplier of the HDRI at 3. The second one has a multiplier at 4.5, and the third one at the multiplier of 6. So you can see between the differences what really the effect of the increased secondary lighting or fill lighting is on your scene. You can have a look especially at these darker areas and in some of these areas around the grass, and you can just see how that shadow starts to disappear as you increase your secondary lighting. And that's exactly what we want to do. We want to reduce the amount of very dark stubborn shadows so that we can start to illuminate these undersides. And that's exactly what happens in real life, where we have so much light bouncing from the sun and from every other element around us that nothing really is in pitch darkness. Now the last one, just to compare, is a render without any HDRI at all. So this is one just with both of these unticked, and it has a plain blue skylight and a slightly blue turquoise environment refraction and reflection. So that is going to be giving us a similar color to the sky itself. So it is quite nice to compare all those things. So definitely this is a part of your workflow where you can have a lot of fun, where you can experiment, you can tweak the figures of all the different parameters, your sun, your HDRI, your camera settings, and eventually you will find that right balance between shade, light, color, saturation, angle, direction, and all the rest. So have fun with this part. This is probably one of the most exciting parts about the rendering itself, is when you can really pretend to be the cameraman in the virtual world and get that perfect shot for your client. So now we're going to finish this lesson, and in the next lesson we're going to look at some of the actual render settings. So here we're talking about the quality of the render itself, and we're just going to increase it and also increase the file size, or the render size in terms of pixels, and we're then going to prepare the render that we can pull into Photoshop for the final and last lesson.